There's a great word in Buddhism called avidya or avidya, which is translated often as ignorance. The first pronunciation is Pali, the second one is Sanskrit. This is such an important, it's probably the key to the whole thing, really. And in the way it's described as the 10th fetter, you could say it is the key to the whole thing. The whole thing being liberation. People often ask me what I mean by liberation, and I'm hesitant to give a very hard definition of that for a couple of reasons, because you can be liberated from the illusion, the fundamental illusion of self, which is a huge adjustment in life. It's a huge insight shift. It has very, very profound implications experientially for you as the practitioner. Now, of course, no self-realization beyond that, even using these terms like you and self and all this and your experience, you have to understand that this is not a paradox. I'm not using these in a contradictory way. I'm using them as conventions because that's how language works. So just to clear that up, because there will be people who say, well, how can you say you, or how can you say my experience, or you wake up to that? It's just it's a way of speaking. But with the realization itself of anatta, the realization of no self, is really an eradication of the fundamental ability to ever actually believe that there is anything like a self, a personal self, a universal self, a conscious self, an infinite self. All of that is seen through fully. And with that, a whole lot is seen through. The experience of form, the experience of an external world, an internal world, all of these are seen very clearly and thoroughly to be illusions. So this is the very important insight of no self-realization. It's definitely a deep stage of realization, relatively speaking, although I'm seeing more and more people wake up to this degree, which is beautiful. It's amazing. It's a huge adjustment. There's a lot to this. There's a lot that goes on before that as well, a lot of other insights that come, and this is far beyond the initial awakening. So understand this is deep stage realization I'm talking about, but in at least one interpretation of the fetters, the dropping of the self structure, the subtle self structure, seeing through it completely, is really the 8th fetter. And yet there is still the 9th and 10th. Specifically, the 10th fetter is what I'm going to talk about now, which is ignorance. So it could be easy to interpret this ignorance, the word or the connotation of ignorance, as something that only a self could have, right? Well, who's there to be ignorant? Who's there to misinterpret? Who's there to misunderstand? That is, if that's the way you're processing or interpreting the word ignorance, that is not what I'm talking about, just so you know. It's not wrong. You can think about this however you want, but that's not the type of ignorance I'm talking about. It's a much more fundamental perturbance. It's a much more fundamental process. It does precede even the self. It's very subtle in a sense. It's a very subtle thing to point to. It's a subtle insight to talk about, and yet its implications are anything but subtle. The difference between functioning out of ignorance in the way we're going to talk about it and functioning out of liberation, let's just say that, to have for lack of a better way of saying it, but to have a way of saying it, is night and day. It's the difference between heaven and hell, truly. So what do I want to say about ignorance, or this avidya? There are different ways to talk about it, different ways to approach it through doctrine and through personal insight, personal experience. But I want to start by saying that a simple enough interpretation to get us started would be the ignorance here means not seeing things as they are. That's an imperfect way of saying it, but it's a simple starting point. Another way of saying it is not seeing reality as it actually is. Now, I've said this before, and immediately someone pointed out, oh, you're saying reality is a certain way, right? Or how is reality, by the way, which is like trying to be a little dharma jousty with me or something. Again, conventional term, conventional phrase, it's just getting us oriented. if I talk about my own direct experience in reference to this, is actually quite the opposite. After all of these shifts occurred, I've talked about this in the documentary and other interviews, shifts including the dropping of any sense of self, just completely obliterated. Still, there were other insights that dawned. And one of the most important ones, and maybe it was kind of, in one sense, it was kind of the final insight that dawned. Now, even that doesn't mean that nothing continues to evolve or devolve beyond that, because it will, because causes and conditions still occur, and they always will, right? However, as far as the insights associated with realization, this was kind of like the final one in one sense. And that was nothing I got out of doctrine, nothing I heard, I'd never heard it before. It just hit me so clearly. It was so obvious. And the way I said it, and I wrote this in the book, the way I said it to myself, or just thought it, and it was kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, exactly. And that is a very simple statement. There is no way that things are. There literally is no way that things are, literally. And that's an insight that immediately, once I realized it, I also realized all of the human forces in the world almost are actually trying not to see this. They're trying to overlook this truth. I could immediately feel energetically, and even through some kind of karmic experience, past lives, don't know what, but I kind of do, but it's a little hard to talk about. I knew that I have to be really cautious how I talk about this. I knew that I could talk to, say, wide spiritual communities, and some of them would turn around and run. This is not something people want to hear. At the same time, once those earlier insights have dawned and settled, and especially the realization of no self has settled, then that insight, there is no way that things are, becomes so powerfully obvious and clear and liberating. So some of this is about when the insight occurs, because you can't really understand this insight through the mind. It's not possible. It's just not. But you can maybe sense it. And as realization progresses, you may sense it as destabilizing. It may lead you directly into existential terror, for instance, and it has, and I've seen it, and it happens, right? It's a very powerful insight in that way, but it's subtle in the sense that it can seem like a cognitive thing. It's not a cognitive thing. It's not about beliefs. It's way deeper than that. So I just wanted to point that out about the simple starting statement that I made, and that is ignorance is really, in this way of speaking, is about not seeing how things actually are. But my own personal experience is paradoxically almost the opposite, and that is seeing that things are not any specific way. Okay. Now, that could sound confusing, but luckily we have Buddhism, because Buddhism explains this pretty well. And that is, there's a doctrine called the three characteristics, which is anatta, no self, dukkha, which is suffering, means suffering or unsatisfactoriness, and anicca, which means impermanence. And these three characteristics are, I'm not a scholar and I'm not a Theravadan Buddhist, but these three characteristics are very clearly elucidated and realized in deep realization, particularly after no self-realization. And even all of those three characteristics, this I don't have a reference from the Pali Canon, this is coming from my own experience. Even those three characteristics, any of those could also be fixated upon. So just be aware, you can fixate on any, and people do this. People do this even through realization, even deep realization. You can still fixate in some of these. You can fixate on impermanence. You can fixate on no self. You can fixate on, to some degree, suffering, depending on how you're interpreting what that means and how it's playing out for you. So just be aware that there's no stated doctrine or piece of doctrine or anything that is not subject to potential co-optation of the mind. So just be aware of that. I think some people like to have a be-all, end-all term, phrase, or something that points to something else in spirituality and Buddhism, like emptiness, for instance, or impermanence. But anything can be reified. Anything can be turned into a concept, reified, or even reified as a experience of realization. Realization is not about experience, but it does correlate with sometimes very profound experiences. And what we can do is we can try to reify that experience, even unconsciously, without realizing we're doing it. So just be aware, even like when I talk about the 3 characteristics or anything, it can get co-opted, but they're very powerful pointers, because they're antidotes. What they point to is very strong tendencies, karmic tendencies, conditioned tendencies, to see the world through a lens that sees essentially the opposite of those characteristics. It's very easy to see the world through a lens that says, no, there's a permanence here somehow, without thinking I'm permanent. It's like, like I have a very real future. I have a very real past. I have a very real metaphysical map, right? All of these are kind of the flavor of permanence, the idea of permanence, that even if we're not calling it permanence, maybe we're just calling it a long time, maybe we're calling it immortality. We're trying, the psychological mechanism is trying to stabilize a timeline, right? It's all about time. Impermanence is all about time and eternity. It's trying to stabilize a timeline in which a self can exist, right? And then that's anatta, the self, right? Or no self. That's a very important insight, very important stage of realization. And it goes hand in hand with the doctrine of impermanence, because it's an antidote to the container that feels like you, right? Like, does time even matter? The idea of past and future matter at all if there's no sense of you? No, you wouldn't care at all. You wouldn't have a thought about it. Can the sense of you exist at all with no sense of the timeline or no sense of moving through time? It kind of can, but it has trouble doing it. It really starts to get threatened when you start to deconstruct time. Now, the reason is because there's also a dualistic construct, right? The sense of being self apart, self another, and so forth. So that aspect can still kind of keep a self intact to some degree, even if we don't feel like we're moving through time or on a timeline, but very thinly, let's say. So you can see how these are related. And again, the characteristics in the way I'm talking now are really just antidotes. They're nothing to be reified as concepts or beliefs or doctrines that guide everything about your practice. That's probably to misuse them, but to see them for what they are, as they're pointers. They're just something pointing. There's a finger pointing right at you going, look there, right? Look into what you feel like is permanent. There are other ways to do that. There's memento mori. You can remind yourself that I have to die. I have to die. I will die. How does that hit you when you do that, right? If you actually do a kind of death inquiry or death meditation with yourself, how does it feel to know this body could die right now? All my loved ones are gone. All my memories are gone. All my aspirations are gone. All my insights are gone. Realization's gone. All of it's gone. The body's gone. In a very short order, a couple hundred years maybe, there'll be no trace of your existence possibly. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't be. But certainly almost everyone will forget about you. All your connections, all your experiences just obliterated in less than a second when the body dies, right? How does that land? Is there something triggering about that? Does it put you in your head? If any of that's happening, that there's still some contraction around that, right? The fear of death, the attachment to self, the attachment to being a discrete entity that moves through time and that it can be somehow permanent in the way we imagine it, like ongoing. These antidotes are very potent and point directly to the fact that you will never find that. You'll never actually find time. And I have tons of video. I have a whole playlist called Time. You also never find a self. I have a whole playlist called No Self. So these characteristics are a good guidepost to what it is when we talk about going back to ignorance, when we look at what it is that we're ignorant of. And we're ignorant of the absence of something, right? That's what the ignorance is. It's not, we're not seeing the world as it is or reality as it is. It's just that we are seeing it as it isn't, right? And again, that was the insight in the way my mind interpreted it. But the insight wasn't mental. It was an energetic experience. And then the mind made this statement, there is no way that things are, right? So that's really what these 3 characteristics are pointing to, that there is no way that things are in the way you're putting it together. There's nothing moving through time. There's no time frame for anything to move through. There's no thing, actually. There's no form, and there's no self. There's no center. There's no separation between subject and object. all of that just becomes exquisitely clear. So there are different ways to talk about the nuances of the three characteristics, and I could even talk about the Dharma seals, which in my opinion are essentially the three characteristics reinterpreted in Mahayana Buddhism and then adding nirvana, right? But none of that is what I need to talk about in this video, because that's just some background to give you some sense of what this is about. Ultimately, if I talk in terms of the process of awakening, realization, unbinding, and specifically deep no self-realization, no self-realization will lead you directly to, hopefully, unless you really fight it. And some people fight it, but it will win. And even if at this stage, if you're fighting it, you'll see there's no one fighting it. You'll see it's really causes and conditions creating that resistance pattern, and it's clear. And yet something still has to fight it for a while until it burns itself out. Call it energetic restlessness or whatever. Call it the remaining will, the energetic will. So at this stage of things, it's really just about seeing, okay, well, what was it, or what is it? What is the misperception that made it seem as if there had to be a self in the first place? Right? Feel into that. What is it about experience? Let's just call it experience. What is it about this that makes it and made it seem as if a self, a discrete, separate self with volition and will, is necessary at all? That's what you're really looking into. And when you look clearly, you'll see this sense that something has to continue in time. Something has to be there to defend itself. Do you see how weird that is? But it's what happens, right? Something has to be here to defend itself. We don't really see that the only reason it's trying to defend itself is because of the illusion that it's here in the first place. This is why this whole thing becomes a very big cosmic joke at some point. But it's a very strong tendency, though. It's not funny when you're going through it. It feels horrible when you're in constant defense mode, self-defense mode, struggling with the world, struggling with your mind, struggling with your emotions, struggling with all of it. It's very, very uncomfortable. And that can start to disentangle itself, that knot of contraction, of resistance, it can start to disentangle itself once that fundamental illusion of self is out, gone, dispelled. Strangely, it will feel even more intense for a while, or it can feel more intense for a while, because there's no filtering anymore. The energetic resistance, you are the energetic resistance. You are feeling it completely everywhere in your body, and even not in your body. It's strong. It's very powerful and potent, and you don't have the ability to step back from it and go, okay, well, this will be gone in a while, or, I know what this is, and like kind of studying it from a distance. You can't study anything from a distance anymore. There's no distance. There's just what's happening, and it's powerful and profound, and other times it's profoundly peaceful. However, at this stage of things, to not adopt a belief and reify no self, reify the absolute such that, there's nothing to practice, there's nothing to do, it's all just conditions, there's no one there. That's probably a mistake, actually, especially at deeper realization, because you're in denial if you think you're not subject to conditions, right? There's a really, really great koan called Yakujo's Fox. Yakujo's Fox. I'm trying to get the pronunciation right. It's a little tricky for Japanese for me. But it's the second koan in the Mumonkan, which is probably the most famous. Well, I don't know if it's the most famous, but the first koan in the collection of koans called the Mumonkan is Mu, which is the most famous by far koan. It's a breakthrough koan. The second one is Yakujo's Fox. And this koan, the upshot of this koan is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to seeing realization. Liberation is not just seeing that there's no self that is itself subject to conditions. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. If you stop there, you will become that fox and be reborn for 500 lifetimes, right? To make it all dramatic. But the other side of it is to see that there's also nothing that can stand apart from causes and conditions. Causes and conditions are all that's left. And they're not a problem. But then you can see that the resistance to those can come in the form of even deep realization. It can come in the form of reifying the absolute. And there are people who speak this way, and it's okay. It's a stage. I went through it. But you'll continue to progress beyond that, which seems odd, because how can you progress beyond like kind of nothing? Or how can you progress beyond the absolute, beyond the complete and absolute lack of a self? Well, realization does actually progress beyond that. It's just not about you. It doesn't progress in any way you could want it or need it or understand it. It's not about you, but it will carry on. And that is subject to causes and conditions, very importantly. That's when you really start to understand freedom. Only the mind that thinks of itself as a self will interpret being subject to causes and conditions as not freedom. Does that make sense? When that self structure is gone, that's why it's so important. The mirror is shattered. You don't see things backwards anymore, and you realize that freedom is in the causes and conditions. It is the causes and conditions as much as it is the fact that there is nobody here, right? So this is a very important part of reversing the tendency towards ignorance and the way we're talking about. This is pointed to in many ways. It's pointed to in the Shin Shin Ming. It's pointed to in Tozan's ranks. It's pointed to some degree in the 10 Oxfording pictures, that in later realization, the interpenetration of relative and absolute is critical. But you still have to make the journey. Without anatta, it will not be a complete journey in that respect at all. So you can try to reify relative and absolute interpenetration too early, and you can do it as a defense mechanism and out of fear of going deeper into realization. So just know that. But once the self-structure is out of the way, then the next fixation would be to fixate in the absolute. And it's very, very easy to do in one sense. It's probably just a stage that you have to go through. There's something about the experience of the absolute that makes it seem impossible that you're fixating. And yet, from the outside, someone will notice and go, oh, yeah, you're fixating. Anyway, so ignorance, to dispel ignorance is to stop seeing things as they're not. Stop seeing things through the lens of subject-object. Stop seeing things through the lens of a self apart from everything. Of course, that's uncomfortable. Stop seeing things in terms of some actually existing timeline on which you and other things and objects and reality is moving, seeing that that's just not the case, right? And once these are seen through, also not reifying the antidote, not reifying the opposite. And this is why, of all the doctrines, I think maybe the clearest, simple statement of doctrine that I find to be accurate in deep realization that also incorporates not being apart from causes and conditions, but being free in and as causes and conditions, is the statement, freedom from extremes. Freedom from extremes. Because before deep realization, the extreme will always be a tendency towards permanence, a tendency towards will, doership, towards struggle. On the other side, there can be a subtle tendency toward the opposite of all those. And then what will happen ultimately is we'll see that both clinging to the illusions of time, separation, form, we'll see that those are equally as empty or as unnecessary as clinging to the formless, to impermanence, to being free from causes and conditions. And now you realize true freedom. I'll read you a beautiful interpretation of Tozan's fifth rank. Pull it up real quick here. That points to this so beautifully. So the fifth rank, it sounds funny, they're ranks, it's like so military, right? It's called unity attained. And the simple phrasing is, if you are not trapped in being or non-being, right? Of course, who can dare to join you? Well, that's a funny question in and of itself. Who? Who can dare to abandon you either? Anyway, I'll just start again. If you are not trapped in being or non-being, who can dare to join you? Everyone wants to leave the ordinary current. This is a really important line. I will see people who are in some deep stage of realization, but there's still fixation around wanting not to be reborn. I know, taboo, right? For me to even say that in Buddhism, like the whole point is to not be reborn, right? Well, if that's a fixation for you, there may be something there, right? It could be a coping mechanism, avoidance mechanism, a fantasy about the afterlife where you're not existing. Is that any different than the afterlife where you're in heaven, right? That fantasy itself, the mechanism of that. So just be aware of that. It's a really important pointer. Everyone wants to leave the ordinary current. Now, it could be that you live in the ordinary current, you're totally mind identified, but you're looking for novelty, right? Novelty is a surrogate for awakening or realization. So that's the person that's leaving the mainstream and going off into, whatever. But it also can mean in the realization process itself, that even the realized will at some point not be free from suffering, and they will want to leave the ordinary current. We could say for the wrong reason. They actually want to leave it to end their own suffering. That's not a full realization of the nature of dukkha, in my opinion, suffering. Unsatisfactoriness. When that's truly, truly realized, unsatisfactoriness and the nature of it, that samsara is nirvana. When that's realized, then there's no intention to not be reborn. There's no intention to be reborn, and there's no intention to not be reborn. Perhaps that's why there's this beautiful statement about a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is someone who has basically given up all defilements and worked through all fixations and so forth, with the exception of compassion, to help free others. The vow would be, I would not enter nirvana until all others before me have, right? It's an extreme vow in a way, but it's also the only vow that's 100% and completely in alignment with the Dharma, in my opinion. And the saying is that only a Buddha can release a bodhisattva from that final bondage, because it's not a bondage. The bodhisattva will be gladly not enter nirvana to serve the enlightenment and realization of others. I went off on a tangent. Let me read this again. If you are not trapped in being or non-being, who can dare to join you? Everyone wants to leave the ordinary current, but in the final analysis, you come back and sit in the ashes.